Today, I would like to speak about the soul power of freedom or true liberation. It's the culmination of our journey through the soul powers of the past weeks, concluding with that which is associated with the crown chakra, the absolute liberation of consciousness or enlightenment. I want to begin with a quote from the Buddha. Know well what leads you forward and what holds you back. Know well what leads you forward and what holds you back, and choose the path that leads to wisdom. Now, for us to be able to choose that path that leads to wisdom, to observe it, to know it, to recognize it, and then choose it, ultimately rests on the freedom that emerges with liberation of consciousness, spiritual awakening, or enlightenment. And, this is why the sages through the ages in, all traditions, all mystical traditions have stressed the primacy of enlightenment or spiritual awakening, to wake up, to be able to live in the soul, to be liberated, to be free from error thinking. So it's freedom to live in the soul, to not be confined to our bad habits, to the reactive patterns, the constricting mental patterns from the past, or to have to be overly reactive to outer conditions. So to be spiritually awake is to be free to choose that which is wise. And that which is wise is that which contributes to well-being, to our own and, of course, to collective well-being. During this extraordinary time, I think that we not only have an opportunity, but an imperative to look and to contemplate, what is it that leads us forward and what holds us back. So I think we need to look at what lifts us up and what contributes to the unfolding of our highest potential and what holds us back from that. And we need to look both in our individual lives, in our sphere, in our own lives and families. And then we need to expand that vision collectively and ask that question globally. And as I began this series of lessons, I started it with an invitation to self-inquiry for us to open our hearts and our minds to very powerful questions. And again, to ask them, and both on an individual scale and a global scale. And so I want to bring those questions back today as I conclude this part of the Satsang series. Starting with the question, what will this time be? What will this time be for me? What will this time be for our world? What is the possibility of this hour in our history, in our personal history, in our global history? What is the possibility of this hour, of this time in history? How will it change me? How will it change us as a global community? What matters most? What matters most to me? What do I consider most important in my own life and in the life of our planet? And then to inquire, how does what's most important or what is needed right now relate to my dharma or higher purpose, and to the global dharma, the global higher purpose? How does what is occurring right now relate to dharma or higher purpose for us individually, and the higher purpose or dharma of our world? And over several weeks, I've offered glimpses into this journey of spiritual awakening that brings with it the unfoldment of spiritual potentials, which are the resources that we need at this time. And when our heart and our mind are purified and we use self-discipline to bring our life into balance, then the innate higher potentials begin to express. The journey of soul awakening, spiritual awakening or enlightenment that occurs, and in accordance with the spiritual tradition of Kriya Yoga, that is destined to occur for every person because it is the revelation of our innate being, is that journey that we begin with that prayer each week. Lead me from the unreal to the real. It is the evolutionary unfoldment of our innate divine capacities that generally follows a map that is associated with the subtle centers of consciousness, which we know as the chakra centers of vital force. And each one of those chakra centers from the root to the crown is associated with a viewpoint, a way of seeing the world, and with developmental capacities, both psychological and spiritual. So in a nutshell, the journey from the base chakra to the crown chakra, where we are today in this series, is the journey from mistakenly identifying with the body and mind, with the material conditions, with ego-based, fear-driven drives, to full realization of the truth of our being and being established in that, so that we are anchored in what is real, what is unchanging, and we are able, through the illumination of heart and mind, of consciousness, to be able to act spontaneously in the right way, in a way that is useful, in a way that is creative, in a way that contributes to well-being. I want to share a quote from Swami Sri Yukteswar describing this journey at the seventh center. He said, "One whose innate knowledge and exceptional abilities are fully awakened comprehends the wholeness of God and all souls as units of God's consciousness. Thus comprehending, one completely abandons the illusion of existence separate from God. This unification of awareness with God is the ultimate aim of every seeking soul. This coming into oneness consciousness, waking up fully to the truth of our being, is what we're all here for." So I've been referring to the story of the warrior Arjuna and the Bhagavad Gita throughout this series. And last week I talked about this revelation that he has of direct experience of the omnipresence of God and his relationship with that soul to spirit, if you will. And then he begins to comprehend and to contemplate this idea of liberation, of freedom, like knowing the truth. What is it like to live that truth? And specifically, he looks at, what is it like to be free? Free from being, overly involved with conditions, free from the sway of the gunas, from the qualities of nature. So he asks in the 14th chapter of the Gita, he asks Krishna, well, what does it look like when someone is free? And so I want to share with you I'm reading from 7 Lessons in Conscious Living, Roy Eugene Davis's translation of these verses in the 14th chapter of the Gita, and then his commentary. So Arjuna is asking, what does it look like when someone is free? How do they behave? And how do they go beyond these attributes? And Krishna responds, such a one neither hates nor desires the presence or absence of the influences of the attributes of nature. So in other words, one is able to observe the sway of these elements, which are always going to be present, whether it's tamas guna, the force of inertia, or rajas guna, force of restlessness, or sattva guna, the uplifting tendency. So one who is free from their sway can observe them without clinging to or being averse to them. That one who is soul-centered and peaceful and is not disturbed by the attributes of nature, who does not waver in that knowledge, to whom discomfort and pleasure are the same, who abides in the self, with capital S, to whom praise, blame, honor, and dishonor are the same, who is dispassionate in regard to friends and foes and has renounced all self-serving tendencies, is said to have transcended. And then the commentary says, an enlightened person, not influenced by subliminal tendencies and ever aware of the difference between the essence of being and the actions of the mind, the body, and nature, is not blindly involved with thoughts, emotions, relationships, or circumstances. So notice it says, not blindly involved. That's the distinction with freedom. So it's not that we're not involved. It's that we're not blindly involved. Life can then be lived wisely, creatively, and spontaneously. And then he goes on to clarify that this spontaneous action is not impulsive behavior, but it is that spontaneous expression of the soul that is no longer restricted by patterns in the mind or outer conditions. And so, I was thinking about the blessing in my life of having encountered several people who I could recognize as being enlightened or spiritually awake. And what were they like? Well, they were clear, and you knew they were clear, and free. And by that freedom, I mean it's obvious that they lived their life from the inside out and not from the outside in. Able to be self-aware and aware of how they influenced others. And I noticed that they're highly focused. They live simply and a disciplined life and a joyful life, which I think is really an important part of the awareness of what it's like to be enlightened or liberated. So it's a disciplined life, it's a focused life, it's a purposeful life, it's a joyful life, and a life of kindness and love and generosity. Everyone that I have met that I could describe this way was dedicated to serving others, that they had reached the pinnacle of this awareness of the truth of life, and what was there for them was to serve others selflessly and with joy. We are living in a time of great suffering, and we cannot deny that, and we shouldn't deny it, but we should also see through it and into it, and remember that suffering is at the top of the list of what motivates us to take up the journey of spiritual awakening. So I think if we open up the lens of our vision perception, our visioning ability at this time, we can see that the innate impulse for enlightenment is being accelerated on a global scale at this time. When we embark on the spiritual journey, when we begin to meditate and practice disciplines of spiritually conscious living, one of the first things that we notice is a growing awareness. Illumination of the mental field. In other words, we begin to see more clearly the connections between our thoughts, our habits, and our experiences in life. We begin to have a quality of seeing that begins to help us make wiser choices. Now, in the beginning, we don't always make the wiser choices. Initially, sometimes we see what is happening and we make poor choices anyway. But as we progress on the path with further illumination, we start to notice what can be termed the pause, where we see clearly what we can choose in that moment that is going to be useful or what is not going to be useful. I came across a quote by Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist, Holocaust survivor, and author of the seminal work, Man's Search for Meaning. He said, between stimulus and response, there is a space. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. So what is the inner and outer pause showing us right now? I mean, we're engaged in this global pause. And what is it revealing to us? I think first and foremost, it's revealing to us that life is connection. So many ways that is being revealed to us. Life is connection. It's not that we didn't know that before. I mean, most of us know that, but it is coming to us so loudly and clearly and profoundly and deeply that life is connection. Life is communion. And the essential value of connection to one's own essence of being, to oneself, to God, to nature, and to one another is being amplified. How important it is to connect to one another. And then I think what is being revealed is what that connection means. It brings meaning to life, it brings joy to life, and that we cannot live for self alone. Because the fallacy of that is being revealed on a grand scale. We cannot live for self alone because there is no such thing as self alone. There are clues everywhere during this pandemic process. And one of the ones that fascinates me is the emergence of masks. So why, you might ask, would I be fascinated with that? Well, if you think about a bigger process and what life itself is teaching us, the interesting thing about masks is that we are asked to wear them, but we are asked to wear them with the understanding that they won't protect us, but that they will protect others. And if we protect others, we ultimately protect ourselves. So I want to conclude my message with a story. It's an old story that's been around for a while, but one I think relevant to our time. There is a seeker of truth who wants to know how to best live and asks for a meeting with God. So she gets the meeting and she asks God, what are these places called heaven and hell like? So of course, because she asked for the meeting and she asked to know, she's taken to the place that God says is hell. And she's shown what hell looks like. And as she comes into the space, she's astounded because it's a beautiful room. And in this beautiful room, there is a table that is a feast. It's a feast that's going on, sumptuous food and drink. And, at first it's astounding. Well, where is the hellfire? But here's this beautiful banquet. But upon closer observation, she sees that there's something strange going on, that all of the people sitting around the banquet table are actually famished. They are starving. And they're in so much suffering and sorrow. And it's because there's an odd thing that has gone on there. There's some kind of a device where the spoons that they have are very long and they're attached to their arms. So they have the ability to reach the food that's in the middle of the table, but because the spoons are so long and attached to their arms, they cannot get the food into their mouths. So all day long, they're sitting at this feast of abundance and they are starving. Right in front of them is the feast, but they are experiencing famine. She asks then, well, what about heaven? And she's told, oh, it's the same banquet room. It's the same feast. And actually, it's the same scenario with the long spoons. But the people who are in heaven are well nourished and they're filled with joy. Well, how does that happen? It's revealed to her that they have learned how to feed one another. What is the potential of this time that we are living in? The potential, as I see it, is for us to move from pandemic to pandharmic, from pandemic to pandharmic, from that contraction to expansion. Let us evolve. And I will continue that topic, pandemic to pandharmic, in our satsangs ahead. Om.